The world was about to witness the emergence of a new species of giant in the gloomy Pacific waters. Still in shock from the destruction of Pearl Harbor, the United States launched an industrial miracle in 1942 that would change the balance of naval power. The Essex-class aircraft carrier, a battleship unlike any other, was at the center of this change. Despite being taken by surprise at Pearl Harbor, America's answer would be nothing short of astounding. Industry's machinery flared to life in a few months. Shipyards used for commercial purposes during peacetime were transformed into military manufacturing facilities. With a resolve motivated by the need to survive as a nation, men and women flocked to industries, riveting plates and welding steel. This mobilization resulted in the creation of the Essex class, which are enormous floating airfields intended to project electricity across oceans. Nearly 27,000 tons were moved by each carrier, which was more than 870 feet long from bow to stern. Squadrons of Avengers, dauntless dive bombers, and Hellcats waited to be let loose on their decks. These were ships that were constructed in months rather than years. They became the epitome of America's ability to transform industrial might into naval superiority after being launched with astonishing rapidity. Aircraft carriers were the key weapons in naval warfare, no longer only auxiliary. This was well known to commanders. The United States might launch a devastating air attack on Japanese strongholds by using the Essex class to strike over great distances. Tokyo had to contend with an adversary that could resupply its forces more quickly than they could be destroyed. In December 1942, USS Essex, the first of these behemoths, went into service. Others soon followed, including Lexington, Intrepid, Yorktown, and Bunker Hill, each a steel fortress armed with radar arrays, anti-aircraft guns, and fortified hangars. They slipped into the ocean with unrelenting regularity. They had more than 90 aircraft on their flight decks, more than enough to crush any fleet or garrison in isolation. The speed with which these vessels came will be remembered with amazement by German prisoners of war who were taken later in Europe. They found it incomprehensible that a country could launch carriers more quickly than an adversary could sink them. The German Navy had been struggling for years to build enough U-boats in the Atlantic. The United States, on the other hand, demonstrated unparalleled industrial organization by launching Essex-class carriers virtually on schedule. The Essex carriers represented tenacity in addition to being steel vessels. Each one was a promise that America would not be left unprotected and that Pearl Harbor would not happen again. Their arrival changed the Pacific's strategic landscape. Rather than responding to Japanese attacks, the U.S. Navy now advanced the war, displaying force with ever-increasing audacity. Operations like the Gilbert's and Marshall's campaigns shone their promise in the Central Pacific. With devastating accuracy, carrier-based aircraft hit enemy airfields, shipping channels, and defense positions. Because of the Essex-class's mobility, no island was secure. A barrage of carrier-launched raids preceded each landing operation, weakening Japanese defenses and isolating key locations. The United States had over a dozen Essex-class carriers in operation by 1944. They served as the core of the most potent naval attack force in history, Task Force 58. They were able to launch thousands of sorties in a single day by working in synchronized groups. This constant pressure caused the formerly fierce Japanese fortifications to collapse. For the first time, American strategy shifted to one of relentless, overwhelming, and constant advance. A crucial reality of contemporary warfare was also illustrated by the Essex class. Production was just as important as battle. If ships and aircraft could be replenished, a lost fight might be fought again. Every defeat was a painful wound for Japan. As new carriers rolled off the slips, America swiftly absorbed the losses. The United States made it clear where the balance of attrition lay, favoring the side that could outbuild its opponent. The American public began to recognize these carriers as the war continued. Newspapers reported on their accomplishments. Newsreels praised them, and sailors who served aboard them carried their memories with them forever. More than just a fleet, the Essex class represented the will and togetherness of the country. In the quiet meditations of captured German soldiers, this reality left its impact. They had faith in the technical superiority of their own war machines, in U-boats and panzers. But the sheer pace and volume of American manufacture was something they could not grasp. No amount of battlefield skill could match the industrial strength of the Essex class. These Titans transported not just planes but also the weight of American determination from the Pacific's oceans. They were the assurance that those who could control the skies above the oceans would once again own them, rather than the aggressors. The Pacific's emerging giants were more than just warships. They represented a nation committed to fighting until victory was achieved and the future of naval warfare. The Essex-class carriers were ready as 1943 broke. Campaigns that would push the conflict farther into enemy territory, from the extreme reaches of the Pacific to the center of Europe, were set in motion. The message was clear to America's adversaries. The tide had changed and would not return. These bearers' story was just the start. The massive Atlantic convoys, where Allied trade lanes became vital for survival and German U-boats lurked, were ahead. The story of the Essex-class carriers, who had become titans of the Pacific, would not be complete without the shock that sparked the development of American industry. The Pearl Harbor attack on the morning of December 7, 1941, shook a country out of its apprehensive neutrality and into full-scale conflict. More than devastation, the smoke rising over Oahu was a call. An industrial giant woke up across the United States. Previously producing merchant vessels, shipyards now had to play a crucial new function. Day and night, the sky above Newport News, Virginia, was illuminated by sparks from welding torches. Cranes swung steel plates across the skyline of the East River in Brooklyn. Slipways in Philadelphia were lined with partially completed hulls, all of which were intended to be survival tools. Every launch was a promise that the blow would not go unreturned, and every rivet pressed was a response to Pearl Harbor. There was a huge demand. The Navy needed fleets that could operate over 2 oceans, not just a few ships. The aircraft carrier, which had demonstrated at Coral Naval and Midway that naval power would now be determined in the skies, was at the heart of this endeavor. Shipyards responded to Congress's authorization of enormous spending by launching an unparalleled construction boom. The USS Essex, with hull number CV-9, was the embodiment of this change. When Japanese planes strafed Hawaii in 1941, she was still on the slips after being laid down at Newport News shipbuilding. Her completion turned into a pressing national issue. On her decks, thousands of men and women worked to install engines, rig cables, weld bulkheads, and lay down the miles of electrical wire required to operate catapults and radar. The Essex was more than just a warship when she was put into service in December 1942, just a year after Pearl Harbor. It was evidence that America's industrial machine was capable of moving at an incredible speed. Built to bring the battle to faraway shores, the floating fortress was 872 feet long, able to accommodate over 90 aircraft, and protected by batteries of 5-inch and 40-millimeter cannons. Both friends and foes were shocked by the speed with which these carriers emerged. Their astonishment was recalled by German POWs taken later in the war. For them, building ships had always been a methodical and slow process. However, this country could produce capital ships more quickly than most navies could swap out destroyers. The magnitude of American resources was highlighted by this reality, which went against European custom. Naval planners in Washington rapidly realized the ramifications. The Essex class was the model for a whole fleet, not just one ship. Parts could be efficiently assembled and manufactured in numerous places because to standardized plans. In record time, raw steel was transformed into carriers in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, Brooklyn Navy Yard, and Newport News Navy Yard. Building dozens of ships was the aim, not just 1 or 2. Every yard turned become a city inside a metropolis. Around the clock, thousands of electricians, machinists, and welders worked in shifts. With firm hands driving rivets into steel plates or testing wiring deep within the ship's interior, women joined the workforce in previously unheard-of numbers. Speed was encouraged by posters. Every launch was hailed by newsreels. They worked together with a sense of urgency because these ships were needed immediately, not tomorrow. When the Essex joined the fleet, tactics underwent a sea change. The Navy was getting ready to move west by the end of 1942, capturing islands and setting up sites that would tighten the noose around Japan. Carriers were now the offensive's main force rather than its defenseless auxiliary. The Navy was able to project force farther into enemy territory with each subsequent launch, guaranteeing that American resolve was equal to its reach. However, carriers were not the only ones affected by the industrial response. From the slips came supply ships, submarines, cruisers, and destroyers. Liberty shipped the supplies, transports the men, and tankers carried the gasoline. At the highest level, however, the Essex class was evidence that the United States had fully realized its potential. The commissioning rituals marked a turning point in the emergence of a democratic arsenal, not only naval customs. It was incredibly fast. A carrier's construction could take years prior to the war. One may now be finished in a fraction of that time due to the urgency of war. Just 12 months had passed since Pearl Harbor when the USS Essex was put into service. Lexington, Yorktown, and Bunker Hill would come soon. Together, they would steam across the Pacific by the middle of the war, a phalanx of mobile airfields. The ships were more than steel and machinery to the individuals who served on them. They carried them thousands of miles from the coast, acting as lifelines and floating dwellings. Their hangars were filled with the odors of aviation fuel and oil, and their decks were turned into launch pads for everyday warfare. Officers controlled the flow of aircraft that would pound Japanese strongholds into submission from the superstructures of their islands. One era came to an end and a new one began with Essex's commissioning in December 1942. America was no longer rushing to protect its coastlines. Now it was getting ready to set the rules of combat. Instead of paralysis, a machine capable of outbuilding, outproducing, and eventually outfighting its adversaries had emerged from the shock of Pearl Harbor. With just one ship, this industrial giant would continue to awaken. It was just the beginning of a massive production drive that would bring American steel to the world's shores in large quantities. The Atlantic's never-ending convoys, which carried not just troops and supplies but also the hope of victory, were ahead. Although it was just the beginning, the Essex had marked the emergence of American naval might. What came next involved more than just building ships. It involved changing naval warfare itself. American shipyards demonstrated by 1943 that industrial power could be used just as effectively as any weapon. Vessels rolled out of their slipways, leaving enemies reeling from their sheer numbers and manufacturing speed. The Yorktown and the Intrepid, whose names would soon be inscribed in the annals of the Pacific War, were at the vanguard of this surge. Just a few weeks after Pearl Harbor, in December 1941, the USS Yorktown, CV-10, was laid down at Newport News. Her engines were installed, decks were attached, and her hull was finished in an incredible number of months. In an unprecedented timetable, she was launched in January 1943 and put into service in April of the same year. It would have taken years for a carrier of her size to get to the ocean in previous decades. CV-11, the USS Intrepid, was not far behind. She was constructed in December 1941 at the Newport News Yard as well, with a furious speed and a sense of urgency. Another giant was ready to transport airplanes across oceans by August 1943. When she was commissioned, these carriers were a part of a larger trend rather than an anomaly. Each was a node in a massive production system that created floating airfields by fusing steel, labor, and willpower. This accomplishment was made possible by a number of elements, including modular construction, standardized designs, and an uninterrupted labor. Because each Essex-class carrier shared plans, parts could be efficiently manufactured and installed at several locations. Boilers, elevator systems, and gun turrets could all be produced at the same time and then assembled like parts of a huge puzzle. Timelines were condensed, and output was multiplied. The outcomes were astounding. 24 Essex-class carriers, together with light carriers, escort carriers, and several supporting vessels, entered the fleet between 1942 and 1945. The scale was incomprehensible to the German POWs who would subsequently consider this. It took generations to replace a battleship lost in battle in their world. However, this country was swapping out whole carrier groups in a single season. They could hardly believe the stories they heard about American fleets getting back into action just months after catastrophic battles. There was a tangible air of urgency on the docks. When bulkheads were sealed, welders' sparks rained down in dazzling arcs while workers with heavy gloves and protective hats labored at a practiced pace. Teams of electricians threaded wires deep inside the ship's interior while cranes hauled armored plating into position. Women, many of whom were new to industrial work, performed precise engine inspections, hammered rivets, and tested circuits. Youngsters were aware of the ship's names before they even left the yard. They represented a nation in motion. When sailors assigned to the Yorktown and the Intrepid boarded, they were entering a floating metropolis. Football fields were the length of the hangar decks, and even longer were the flight decks. Machine shops, sick cells, mess halls, and galleys that could feed thousands were all located in compartments beneath the decks. With numerous armored decks, enhanced damage control systems, and redundant power supply, each carrier represented robustness in addition to firepower. They were built to withstand the strikes that had destroyed previous carriers and come back to battle another day. There were significant tactical ramifications. The air group of a carrier was its greatest asset, and the Yorktown and Intrepid could each carry over 90 aircraft. TBF Avengers, SB-2C Helldivers, and F-6F Hellcats crowded their hangars, all poised to take off from hydraulic catapults that sent them into the air. By using these planes, the Navy was able to strike enemy facilities, convoys, and fleets without warning, reaching hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. These ships changed the balance of power when they entered the Pacific theater. The loss of a single carrier used to have the power to change the direction of a campaign, but now replacements came in quick succession. The Japanese have had a difficult time reassembling their broken carrier force following the Battle of Midway. It was extremely difficult for them to replace even a single fleet carrier. For the U.S., the issue was not if replacements could be constructed, but rather when they would be available. This discrepancy was not overlooked. When informed of the statistics, German prisoners who were being questioned in camps from Britain to the United States expressed surprise. Reports of American shipbuilding had been viewed by some as misinformation meant to depress morale. It was sobering to learn that such allegations were accurate. They realized that they were up against an opponent whose resources seemed limitless, regardless of the bravery of their warriors or the caliber of their weapons. The influx of new carriers gave American strategists the opportunity to develop ambitious plans. Previously shaky island-hopping campaigns may now be maintained by mobile air power. Once considered vital for land-based aircraft, bases in the Central Pacific ended up serving as stepping stones rather than lifelines. Airfields accompanied task forces wherever they went, shielded by screens of destroyers and cruisers, and fueled by transports and tankers that followed the same mass production routine. Like its sister ships, the Intrepid and the Yorktown soon became veterans. Within months of being put into service, their decks engaged in action, attacking Japanese strongholds in the Marianas and Marshalls. As ground troops toiled diligently below, pilots who soared from their decks fought day after day, returning to rearm. These ships didn't just exist. They were always moving, their engines propelling them forward for the next battle, their flight decks resonating with the sound of landings and takeoffs. The repercussions were obvious. The ability to replace losses more quickly than they might be caused has altered naval warfare, not just strategy. Who could maintain the flow of steel and planes over time, rather than who had the most ships at any one time, now controlled the sea. America had a clear advantage in this arena. The change was still happening more quickly. New hulls were slipping down the channels, their names already decided, their keels bound for the Pacific, while Yorktown and Intrepid were proving themselves in combat. The narrative would go on from the shipyards to the enormous convoys that transported American might over the seas. America's ability to outbuild its adversaries had been demonstrated in the shipyards, but the actual extent of this power would be exposed at sea. Launched in a constant stream, the Essex-class carriers now constituted the core of a striking force that had never been seen before. Task Force 58 proved that distance was no obstacle to American weapons by launching an airpower projection deep into the Pacific from these floating airfields. The Central Pacific Offensive was led by Task Force 58, which was tactically led by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher and overall commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance. Dozens of squadrons were transported by its carriers, including Grumman F-6F Hellcats, Curtiss SB-2C Helldivers, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and Grumman TBF Avengers packed on their decks. No other fleet could match the task force's coordination and firepower by the beginning of 1944. It was a simple but groundbreaking concept. American commanders employed carriers to hit targets hundreds of miles away rather than deploying warships to fight enemy fleets at gun range. As pilots trained in long-distance flights and navigators plotted exact courses, entire squadrons could emerge from the decks and disappear into the horizon, leaving those still on board unaware of their destinations. They would return hours later, frequently with the wounds of battle, but with charred airfields, broken ships, and weakened defenses. When Task Force 58 attacked the Marshall Islands in January 1944, it was one of the first significant protests. Waves of Hellcats blasted into the air from flight decks dispersed throughout many ships, followed by Avengers with torpedoes and Dauntless ready for attacks that involved a steep dive. From above, Japanese bases at Kwajalein and Roynamore were hammered. According to reports, hostile planes were destroyed before they could even take off after being trapped on the ground. The American onslaught was too strong for the fortifications to withstand, even when anti-aircraft fire rose to meet the attackers. Later, pilots remembered seeing entire island bases explode in flame and smoke. Fuel depots caught fire, supply dumps were ripped apart, and hangars fell. The return of their aircraft brought its own strain to the sailors on deck. The Hellcats and Avengers circled back one by one, landing on the narrow flight decks with their wings folded. Deck personnel rushed ahead, pushing damaged aircraft clear so the next could land and removing injured pilots from cockpits. The cycle of launch, strike, recover, and prepare again had become the rhythm of war. The size of these strikes increased in the months that followed. In February 1944, Task Force 58 advanced on Truk Lagoon, a Japanese stronghold known as the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Previously believed to be impregnable, it was now accessible. American squadrons destroyed the anchorage during a two-day air assault. Airfields were made useless, transports were sunk, and ship after ship was set on fire. Despite having been forewarned, the Japanese fleet had reduced its size, but the damage to their logistical center was devastating. German POWs who learned about these actions through interrogations or documents they had obtained expressed shock. They found it astounding that carrier groups could bring such lethal power to bear from hundreds of miles offshore. According to their understanding of naval tradition, fleets had to close the distance prior to combat. This fleet, however, was capable of destroying targets without ever exposing its capital ships to opposing fire. According to several prisoners of war, these reports must be inflated. Realizing the truth, some interpreted it as proof that the Reich was up against an adversary with a completely different scale of operation. The tactical advantages were obvious. Task Force 58 prevented Japanese defenders from focusing by hitting far from shore. Bases that had been expected to support counterattacks were destroyed before they could be used. Convoys of supplies trying to get to remote garrisons were stopped and dispersed. Even morale suffered, as the once assumed safety of distance vanished. No island was beyond reach, no base secure. For the American fleet, these operations tested coordination on an immense scale. At the same time, air controllers oversaw dozens of squadrons in flight. Communication between carriers was constant, ensuring that strikes were staggered for maximum effect and that returning groups did not collide in the crowded skies above the task force. Logistics ships kept pace, refueling carriers at sea and replenishing their magazines with bombs and torpedoes. This integration of combat and support allowed operations to continue without pause. Sailors and aviators alike lived with the strain of constant tempo. Pilots faced missions that lasted hours over open ocean, where a single navigational error could mean running out of fuel with no carrier in sight. Deck crews worked around the clock, repairing planes battered by flak, rearming them with precision, and keeping the flight decks clear for the next wave. For every sortie that reached its target, there were hundreds of men whose unseen labor made it possible. Strategically, the impact was decisive. The fall of the Marshalls, followed by the crippling of Truk, opened the road to the Marianas. Each success demonstrated that Japanese defenses could be bypassed and neutralized by air power alone. It was not just the destruction inflicted but the speed of the advance that mattered. With each island seized or neutralized, the carriers pushed closer to Japan's inner defenses. The sight of multiple carrier decks launching planes in synchronized operations became a symbol of Allied momentum. Observers described the horizon filled with aircraft, their engines merging into a single rolling thunder. From the perspective of those on the receiving end, the strikes seemed to come from nowhere, overwhelming in their suddenness and devastating in effect. By mid-1944, the pattern was unmistakable. Wherever Task Force 58 sailed, Japanese strongholds crumbled. The effectiveness of carrier warfare was no longer in question. It had become the dominant form of naval power. And for those imprisoned in distant camps, hearing fragments of news from guards or Red Cross bulletins, the realization was sobering. The oceans no longer sheltered the Axis. American carriers had made every corner of the Pacific a potential battlefield. The stage was now set for the next phase. Operations against the Marianas, where the scale of carrier battles would reach unprecedented heights, and where the skies themselves would become the decisive arena. The American carrier's reach was demonstrated by the thunder of Task Force 58's attacks. However, in one of the war's most spectacular engagements, the groundwork for this philosophy had already been established. We need to go back to June 1942, when the seas around Midway Atoll served as the backdrop for a sea change that revolutionized modern warfare, in order to fully comprehend the force of American naval strength. After overwhelming victories across the Pacific and Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Imperial Navy remained powerful and attempted to trick the U.S. fleet. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto came up with the bold idea of capturing Midway Island, attracting the last American carriers, and destroying them in a decisive battle. If successful, Japan would have firm control over the Pacific. However, American cryptographers had cracked portions of the Japanese code while they were working nonstop at Pearl Harbor. The impending strike against Midway was disclosed by intelligence. The Pacific Fleet's commander, Admiral Chester Nimitz, took a risk. The Americans would set their own trap rather than fall into Yamamoto's. Northeast of Midway, carriers USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the freshly restored USS Yorktown stood poised to surprise the assailants. Japanese carriers started their first wave early on June 4, 1942. Despite the island's fortifications, Midway's installations were destroyed by dive bombers and torpedo planes. American planes were already in the air, frantically searching for their objectives, even as Japanese planes returned. Marine Corps fighter squadrons emerged from Midway itself, fighting deadly dogfights with superior Japanese aircraft. Although they suffered severe losses, they purchased valuable time with their sacrifice. Torpedo squadrons attacked the Japanese fleet at low altitude from the American carriers. Despite the overwhelming odds, they pushed on without a fighter escort. Almost all of them were destroyed, flying outdated aircraft against speedier Zero fighters and a wall of anti-aircraft fire. These aviators' bravery appeared to have been in vain. However, their activities forced Japanese combat air patrols to sea level, temporarily exposing the sky above. History was altered by that brief opportunity. At the crucial moment, dive bombers from Yorktown and Enterprise arrived high overhead. As refueling and rearming aircraft swarmed Japanese decks, the SBD Dauntless squadrons pressed into their dives. Bombs dropped with terrible precision. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, three of Japan's frontline carriers, were consumed by fire in a matter of minutes. Despite the crew's valiant efforts to limit the infernos, they were unable to survive due to bursting ammunition and fuel. Hiryu, the fourth carrier, launched counterattacks later that day, causing damage to Yorktown. However, American perseverance was unwavering. By nightfall, Hiryu was found by Dauntless bombers, who launched a powerful attack. She was also burned and left behind. The heart of Japan's carrier force had been shattered in a day. The Imperial Navy was taken aback by the magnitude of the catastrophe. They lost more than 200 aircraft, for carriers, and valuable seasoned personnel. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been led by these very units. For Japan, Midway was a strategic disaster rather than merely a tactical setback. They were unable to launch offensive operations in the Pacific. The triumph meant a great deal to the Americans. For the first time, the Japanese advance was firmly halted. It demonstrated that the primary weapons of naval warfare were now aircraft carriers rather than battleships. The Pacific War was changed by the bravery of the torpedo squadrons, the accuracy of the dive bombers, and the cooperation of fleet commanders. Both sides' survivors have clear memories of Midway. The pungent smoke billowing over the horizon was described by American sailors as evidence that fortune had shifted in their favor. As carrier after carrier was destroyed by fire, Japanese veterans expressed their incredulity. In those terrible hours, the aura of invincibility that had encircled their armada vanished. Midway's influence extended well beyond the Pacific. German U-boat teams keenly examined the lessons learned as news of the engagement circulated throughout Europe. The idea that 4 major carriers could be destroyed in a few days was shocking to sailors used to stalking convoys under the Atlantic seas. It verified that there had been an irreversible change in the balance of naval strength. Carriers were now the fleet's pivotal component, not an experiment or an add-on. Naval planners in Berlin were confronted with a harsh truth. The Kriegsmarine had always prioritized surface raiders and submarines over carriers. Midway emphasized the cost of such choice. The strategic reality that a country capable of replacing fleets and mastering carrier warfare would be beyond the reach of Axis sea power was acknowledged by German prisoners of war after they were informed of the outcome. The ships that sank into the Pacific were not the only way that Midway left its mark. The resulting ideology contained it. From then on, carrier task groups became the cornerstone of American commanders' entire offensive plan. The Essex-class ships that were being built were the tools of a new era, not merely replacements. Island by island, air power at sea would propel the advance across the Central Pacific until Japan itself was exposed. However, the win was not yet inevitable for the 1942 sailors. The war was still protracted and unclear. Their endurance would be put to the test by the sacrifices made at Coral Sea and the upcoming battles at Guadalcanal. However, Midway gave them confidence, which was essential. It demonstrated that the United States could halt Japan's growth and take the initiative if it had the will and intelligence to do so. Historians now consider Midway to be one of the major turning moments in the Second World War. It was impossible to reverse the abrupt loss of 4 Japanese carriers. Even while it was still gaining power, America had dealt a blow so devastating that it changed the entire Pacific's balance. On June 4th, the fires of the vanquished illuminated the horizon as the sun sank. An era has come to an end in the Pacific. The age of the battleship was over. From now on, carriers will determine a country's destiny. The groundwork for the protracted and taxing island operations, in which carrier might would propel the assault toward Japan's inner defenses, was also laid after Midway. Although the balance of naval combat had been altered by the Midway victories, the maritime conflict was far from done. Another fight raged in the broad Atlantic as America's carriers turned the tide in the Pacific. From North America to Britain, the convoy channels continued to be vital lifelines that were constantly in danger. For the U-boats that used to freely navigate those seas, a new weapon was about to make them seem suddenly smaller. By 1943, thousands of Allied commerce ships had been sunk by German submarines. Once out of the reach of land-based aircraft, wolf packs prowled the mid-Atlantic gap. Convoys sustained horrendous casualties for months while escorts valiantly attempted to protect their charges. However, that distance was narrowing. Small but lethal warships known as escort carriers were introduced by the Allies. They were converted merchant hulls that carried a small aviation group, often Avengers for anti-submarine raids and Wildcats for combat air patrol. They played a unique and crucial role, hunting the hunters, despite being dwarfed by fleet carriers. USS Bogue, designated CV-9, was one of them. She was the leader of what became known as hunter-killer units after being commissioned in late 1942. Her duties as a destroyer escort included actively searching the seas for submarines in addition to defending convoys. The once invisible underwater threat became a target when Bogue's planes allowed the Allies to see hundreds of miles farther. Her aircraft and escorts followed U-172, a long-range submarine, as it returned from patrol in December 1943. The U-boat was forced to surface following a protracted pursuit that included depth charges and aircraft strikes. A fierce battle ensued, with carrier-based aircraft strafed the deck and destroyer gunners fired. Survivors were left adrift in the frigid Atlantic when U-172 sank beneath the waves. Several were apprehended, their cheeks white with fatigue. It was a moment of vindication for the bogue seamen. The prey have turned into the hunts. The triumph was not unique. A few months later, U-575 was cornered by Bogue's Avengers and Wildcats. Together with escorts, they mercilessly harassed the submarine until it was destroyed as well. Later, those who had been dragged out of the sea acknowledged experiencing a new form of fear. Once a wide sanctuary, the Atlantic had become smaller. Any hour might see aircraft swooping down from a previously safe sky. This change was psychological as much as tactical for U-boat crews. Their territory had been the sea, a place of surprise and darkness. However, with escort carriers cruising the oceans, no area of water appeared inaccessible. Hardened guys who had once chased defenseless freighters were terrified by the quiet drone of an airplane engine overhead. Inmates muttered to interrogators that the water seemed to shrink each month, as if the entire horizon were covered by Allied wings. Hunter-killer bands grew formed around ships such as Bogue. While some scanned hazardous areas, others directly defended convoys. Their planes patrolled the oceans, firing depth charges, dropping sonobuoys, and coordinating strikes with escorts below. Coordination became crucial as pilots communicated positions to surface ships and destroyers' sonar pings led Avengers to their targets. It was combined arms combat, refined on the Atlantic's undulating waves. There were enough hulls to carry on the battle thanks to American manufacturing. The fleet was joined by dozens of escort carriers, each of which was a floating airstrip brimming with planes prepared to strike at any time. Their presence tipped the scales, increasing U-boat losses at a rate that Germany was unable to match. The hunters who had formerly posed a threat to Britain's existence were now confined and unable to act with the same latitude that had previously characterized their threat. By the end of 1943 and the beginning of 1944, the numbers were clear. Merchant losses gradually decreased, but U-boat sinkings increased. The crucial supply of soldiers and supplies to Britain grew, and the convoy passages became safer. The cross-channel invasion plans would have failed without the supply network. The difference was created by escort carriers, which were little in size but had a huge impact. Between attrition at sea and production ashore, the Battle of the Atlantic was always a struggle for endurance. Endurance leaned heavily in the direction of the Allies, with Bogue and her sisters patrolling the gap. Although the U-boats remained a threat, their reign of terror was coming to an end. The change was acknowledged by German commanders, who acknowledged that the ocean had become hostile ground due to air power, even in its smallest carrier form. Victories were accompanied by sobering reminders of sacrifice for the men of Bogue. Pilots searched for even the smallest shadow as they flew lengthy, exhausting patrols over barren oceans. Escorts' depth charges reverberated through steel decks as they withstood storms and unexpected attacks. However, their tenacity made sure that armies, food, and weaponry made it to Europe undamaged. With every U-boat destroyed, many of people were kept from starvation or drowning in the frigid Atlantic night. The hunter-killer groups are a living example of adaptability and determination. Escort carriers used steel wings to tie together areas of the ocean that previously appeared too big to patrol. German submariners had to question whether there was any safety at all once they introduced air cover to the furthest regions. With the tilt of the Atlantic campaign, focus turned to the European continent. An ever-increasing force was now bolstered by supplies coming into Britain, ready for the day when those convoys would launch an unprecedented invasion. They had secured the maritime passages. The world's attention was now focused on the Western European coast, where the war's next phase was set to begin. The world has witnessed firsthand how tiny carriers could change the oceans through the unrelenting pursuit of German U-boats across the Atlantic. However, the Pacific required an even larger display of carrier power as the Allies tightened their hold on Europe. That display took place over the Philippine Sea in the summer of 1944, during a fight that would be referred to as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in whispers of awe. Japan's naval aviation force was only a shadow of its former might by the middle of 1944. Experienced pilots had been drained away by the losses at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons, while American industry produced an astounding number of trained crews and thousands of new aircraft. Nevertheless, Japan's leadership thought that by attacking the Mariana Islands invasion, it could stop the U.S. progress. In order to overwhelm the adversary, the daring but desperate plan depended on massed carrier aviation. The U.S. Navy was prepared. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet's Fast Carrier Force, Task Force 58, transported hundreds of aircraft on board its Light and Essex-class carriers. Torpedo aircraft and dive bombers provided support for the F-6F Hellcats, which made up the Fighter Arms Corps. The task force headed west to defend the invasion beaches and confront the Japanese fleet, surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. It joined the conflict on June 19, 1944. Wave after wave of planes lifted into the dawn sky from Japanese decks. Their goal was straightforward: destroy the American carriers and end the invasion. The defenders were given valuable time when American ships' radars picked up the formations well before they did. Scrambling, fighters climbed high to intercept. One of the most unfair air fights in history was about to take place. They went to work. Hellcats, the Grumman fighter, which was built for firepower, toughness, and range, was a devastating weapon in battle. American squadrons were disciplined and ripped through the Japanese formations as they moved in. Aircraft after aircraft, wings falling apart, engines trailing smoke, spiraled into the sea. Exploding rounds filled the air as American gunners on ships joined their own fire. Few of the Japanese planes that managed to break through were able to hit their targets because they were up against multiple layers of protection. The extent of the damage became evident by the afternoon. In one day, over 300 Japanese aircraft were lost. There were oil slicks and wrecks all over the ocean, and rafts and parachutes were scattered among the waves. In contrast, the American losses were small. The disparity was so pronounced that pilots would later refer to the battle as a turkey shoot, a term that would live on in history. The outcome was disastrous for the Japanese Navy. It had wasted the best of its carrier air power on a single, fruitless endeavor. Japan's carriers, which were magnificent in appearance but had little ability to affect the war, were reduced to empty shells in the absence of skilled aviators. The initiative in the Pacific was then and forever the American effort. The fight was both a victory and a frightening experience for American crews. Pilots brought back to their ships tales of entire squadrons being destroyed and of enemy aircraft that appeared ill-prepared and hurried into combat. There could not have been a more striking contrast with the rigorous American training program. In order to replenish losses and increase strength, new pilots graduated from flight schools around the United States each month. The supply of skilled men had long since dried up for Japan. Even spectators far from the Pacific were aware of the magnitude of the victory. German soldiers who had been captured heard about the battle in prisoner camps. 300 planes were destroyed in a single battle, swept out of the sky by carriers that seemed to keep producing fighters indefinitely. The numbers were staggering. The stories seemed fantastical to men who had previously thought that the Reich's technology was superior, as if America's carriers could call forth storms whenever they pleased. The Marianas were strategically sealed during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam fell one after the other as Japanese air defenses were destroyed. Their capture allowed the B-29 superfortresses to take the war right to the enemy's doorstep by providing the United States with airfields that were within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. The Pacific had shrunk, and Japan's chances of surviving had decreased. This solidified the notion of the unstoppable carrier. In addition to showcasing superior material power, the U.S. Navy had shown that industrial might, radar coordination, and focus training could completely destroy an adversary in direct combat. No Japanese carrier force would ever again challenge American supremacy at sea after that day. The war had not ended, however. Japan maintained control of a huge territory, protected by resolute soldiers and fortified islands, while being handicapped in the air. The fights for the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were still to come. They would put every Marine, pilot, and sailor to the test. Amidst the sound of engines and the crash of aerial warfare, the seas surrounding the Marianas were silent once more. However, for those who were there, The key weapon of the Pacific War was confirmed to be carrier aircraft in June 1944. Because the enemy's wings were severed, America's offensive proceeded without worrying about aerial retaliation. The next phase of the conflict was well underway as the Marianas victory sent shockwaves across the Pacific. As the Philippines waited for freedom, the United States naval might was put to the test once more against a determined adversary that was unwilling to give up. The deadly reach of American carrier aircraft had been exposed in the skies over the Marianas. However, the biggest risk of the war was played out on the beaches of Normandy in Europe, even as triumph reverberated across the Pacific. With the promise of freedom, thousands of Allied ships crossed the English Channel there. Another war, unseen, silent, and no less important, lay behind their trip. Since the beginning of the war, the Atlantic was plagued by the menace of German U-boats. Although the Allies were in control by 1944, the threat persisted. The biggest seaborne force in history was represented by the convoys that assembled for the Normandy invasions. The invasion itself might fail if submarines managed to penetrate and sink even a small portion. It was the Germans' final opportunity to change the Atlantic tide. It served as a test of the massive defense apparatus that the Allies had constructed. The escort carriers were at the center of such defense. These ships, which were smaller than the enormous Essex-class Titans, were built with the sole intention of providing air protection to convoys that were inaccessible to land-based aircraft. By June 1944, the mid-Atlantic waterways were monitored by vessels, such as the USS Card and USS Croatan. They had Avengers and Wildcats on their flight decks, tough planes designed to hunt submarines. They established hunter-killer parties with destroyer escorts, scouting the seas for the hidden predators beneath the waves. The size of the assault fleet as it came together was astounding. Over 5,000 ships entered the channel, including transports, landing boats, battleships, and destroyers. Every mile was stressful for the men on board. They were aware that torpedoes awaited beneath the surface and that German eyes were on them. The escort carrier's job was to make sure those anxieties didn't come true. The systematic patrols are described in historical reports. At daybreak, planes rose from the wooden decks and flew into the sky, their wings folding out. Avenger aircraft circled over the convoy lanes, carrying rockets and depth charges. Pilots searched the oceans for the black contour of a submarine hull or the distinctive feather of a periscope. The attack came quickly after contact. Bombs exploded with enormous plumes when they fell into the ocean. Rolling depth charges that shook the sea with thunder, destroyer escorts closed in. During one patrol, a U-boat was relentlessly attacked and forced to surface by the USS Card's planes. Smoke and flame streamed out as escort shells crashed into its conning tower. Their submarine fell under, and survivors jumped into the surf. Other accounts described rocket-damaged submarines that sank to the bottom after being rendered lifeless in the water. Each kill was the result of a coordinated effort involving radar, sonar, aircraft, and ships to eliminate the wolf packs that used to terrify the Atlantic. The effects were felt by the invading convoy sailors as they traveled steadily. They traversed the channel's gloomy seas night after night, only able to hear the distant roar of engines. The transports never experienced the feared torpedo eruptions. The armada continued unhurt as escorts ran through the waves, their sonar pings resonating in the steel hulls. It appeared quite miraculous to many. In actuality, it was the result of years of grueling education, advancements in technology, and the unwavering attention to detail of men who fought and flew far from the Normandy beaches. German morale suffered greatly as a result. Once, knowing that the sea was on their side, submarine personnel had cruised with the assurance of hunters. They were being pursued by 1944. There was risk on every patrol. Aircraft might suddenly hit, plunging through fog and clouds. In the midst of the ocean, survivors who had been taken prisoner after sinkings described a relentless foe who could bring the sky itself down upon them. The invasion's lifeline was strategically ensured by the escort carriers and their escort success. Without them, the June 6th passage may have been characterized by strewn survivors in the ocean and flaming wreckage. Instead, the soldiers that would advance into France were delivered by the fleet, which arrived at the beaches undamaged. Before the first landing craft hit beach, the silent battle under the waters had been won. The lesson was deep for leaders of the United States and the Allies. Frequently disregarded in favor of the large fleet units, the tiny carriers had shown to be invaluable. Their planes closed the mid-Atlantic gap and made sure that no U-boat could attack without repercussions by extending a shield across thousands of miles. Their significance to the safe transit of personnel and supplies that enabled victory in Europe was measured, despite the fact that they were not ostentatious vessels. The ocean beyond remained protected as the Normandy beaches erupted with fire and resolve. Infinite convoys of reinforcements, tanks, ammunition, and weaponry were transported by the waves. Every journey fortified the bridgehead, and every safe landing drew the war's conclusion nearer. The crews of the escort carriers knew that their combat, though frequently invisible, was just as important as the battles taking place on land. So they continued to sail non-stop, their decks aglow with activity. The Allies were well established in France by the end of June. The risk had paid off. However, the war continued, and the carriers would once more be asked to project strength across great distances in both Europe and the Pacific. The U-boat's shadow was disappearing, but there were still obstacles in the way that would require even more determination. The carrier's tale was one of perseverance and reach, from the Atlantic's depths to Normandy's beaches. The biggest invasion in history was able to pass unchallenged because their aircraft changed the course of an invisible conflict. Another chapter was about to begin, one in which naval might would once more prove crucial on a never-before-seen scale as the Allies pushed inland. Unopposed, the convoys to Normandy had passed the guarded Atlantic. However, the Pacific War entered its most difficult phase as victory in Europe drew nearer. Here, the Japanese resorted to the kamikaze, a weapon conceived of despair. This new threat would be a terrifying and challenging experience for the carriers that had swept away enemy fleets. The Imperial Japanese Navy was in ruins by the end of 1944. America's fast carriers now control the seas after its final big attempt at the Leyte Gulf failed. However, Japan had not yet been vanquished. Its leaders adopted a somber plan: suicide assaults in which planes were sent straight toward Allied ships. These pilots, many of whom had no training, flew planes loaded with fuel or explosives and targeted destruction with their lives. It was a weapon designed to sink steel as much as to destroy morale. The initial waves occurred during the campaign in the Philippines. Columns of airplanes were reported to have plummeted into American decks while their engines screamed and their wings were on fire from gunfire. USS Franklin and USS Bunker Hill were among the carriers that were targeted. With their crowded crews and wide flight decks, a single successful strike might have disastrous consequences. The Franklin was captured off the coast of Japan on March 19, 1945. As enemy planes raced overhead, 2 bombs soon after hit her deck. Ammunition boiled off, fueled planes exploded, and firestorms swept across her hangars in a matter of seconds. Bulkheads were blasted apart by explosions, and individuals were flung over steel corridors. The ship appeared doomed for hours. Her crew, however, fought with grim determination. Men evacuated flaming aircraft, shut damaged compartments, and hauled hoses along smoke-choked passageways. The Franklin managed to keep afloat despite all obstacles. The USS Bunker Hill went through a similar experience just a few weeks later. In a matter of seconds, 2 kamikazes struck her flight deck. The explosions released infernos that ate huge parts of the ship, planes, and fuel lines. The destruction claimed the lives of hundreds. The pictures that made it to American shores depicted a ship covered in black smoke, her proud figure all but gone. But like the Franklin, she did not sink. She hobbled back to port, a wounded giant refusing to give up, her damage irreparable. Kamikaze strikes have left scars on other carriers. Waves of frantic attackers confronted the USS Saratoga, USS Enterprise, and USS Intrepid. In search of openings in flak barrages, pilots dove from the sun. None of them produced the strategic collapse Japan had hoped for. Some exploded harmlessly into the sea, while others tore into steel. Damage control teams consistently contained flames and resumed operations with practiced efficiency. Days or even hours later, planes were back in the air. It was a blistering experience for pilots and sailors. Unlike regular warfare, the sight of an enemy plane purposefully navigating into one's ship carried a psychological weight. Resilience, however, turned out to be the solution. Men talked of determination as well as shock. They gained confidence in the repair teams, the armorers, and the training that taught them to respond without hesitation. Although the kamikaze caused pain, the carriers' spirits were unbreakable. In terms of strategy, the campaign had two sides. Heavy casualties were caused by kamikazes, and the cost to individual ships was high. However, Japan could not repay the expense. Every pilot lost signified the final remnants of a diminishing force, consisting of irreplaceable men and machines. In contrast, America persisted in launching an overwhelming quantity of fresh troops, ships, and aircraft. Desperation was faced with industrial strength, and desperation was unable to triumph. News of the kamikaze circulated immediately. German POWs in Europe read about carriers that were destroyed by fire, but they were able to return to duty a few weeks later. The tenacity was astounding for guys who had grown up believing that an enemy fleet could be destroyed by a single strike. According to reports, they were shocked that ships so damaged could be fixed, reconstructed, and deployed more quickly than Germany could build a single submarine. For them, it validated what the Atlantic convoys had previously hinted at. American might was not just immense, but boundless. Beyond the Pacific, the picture of Franklin and Bunker Hill, damaged but unbroken, held significance. It conveyed to both allies and adversaries that the carrier fleet was invincible in spirit. Despite being pierced by sacrifice and fire, it rose again and struck with new vigor. The push against Japan could not be stopped by kamikaze techniques, but they may postpone it. The carriers were still playing an unrelenting role by the spring of 1945. Even though they were constantly in danger, they backed landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa and projected air power across contested skies. Every new strike highlighted the pointlessness of resistance while also posing a threat. Others pushed ahead for each ship that was damaged. Despite all the deaths, the mission continued. The kamikaze campaign demonstrated the limits of American perseverance as well as the depths of Japan's despair. It was a battle of resolve as much as steel and fire, and the U.S. Navy proved to be unbeatable in that battle. The war drew closer to its conclusion when flight decks were restored and flames were put out. The carriers looked toward Japan itself, scarred but unbowed. The last battles and the decisive weapon that would end the war were still to come. Normandy's hedgerows had been abandoned, but the maritime conflict continued unabated. The account of Cannes' liberation in the preceding chapter demonstrated how entire divisions were absorbed by land engagements. The focus now returns to the seas, where the outcome of the war was decided by yet another conflict. The knowledge that an adversary could construct carriers more quickly than they could sink them was what ultimately destroyed the will of Germany's submariners, not any particular battle. The German U-boat arm bore the burden of expectation from the beginning of the conflict. Admiral Karl Donitz thought Britain could be choked to death by a concentrated submarine fleet. He appeared to be correct in the early years as convoys burnt and Allied shipping losses increased. However, a far-off tide was gathering across the Atlantic as wolf packs attacked with lethal accuracy. Welding torches illuminated the night sky in American shipyards, and within months, new carrier drawings went from drafting tables to steel reality. By 1943, German POWs recovered from sinking U-boats started to realize what their superiors had not acknowledged. This was an industrial battle, not just a tactical one. The most obvious manifestation of its power was the Essex-class carriers. Each ship, which was larger than anything Germany could have imagined building, could discharge wave after wave of aircraft over thousands of miles of water and displaced over 27,000 tons. They were produced in Newport News, Brooklyn, and Philadelphia shipyards in a manner more comparable to factory manufacturing than conventional naval building. America launched new carriers in succession, each named with ceremony but rushed at a rate that left German observers incredulous, while Britain and Japan battled to replace losses. The United States used to launch many fleet carriers in the time it took the Reich to construct a single sophisticated submarine. During interrogation, captured seamen freely expressed their surprise. After their U-boats were sunk, Men rescued from cold waters acknowledged that they had seen Allied carrier task forces loom over the horizon in seemingly endless fashion. The fact that dozens more were already at sea and that more were on the way, rather than just the size of one ship, was what worried them the most. According to prisoner reports, there was an increasing sense of futility. How could thin submarines, which each required months of training and limited resources, hope to compete with an opponent that constructed floating airfields on a regular basis? This disparity was brutally brought to light during the Pacific War. In what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American carriers fired more than 1,000 aircraft in synchronized strikes during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. German officers were also startled by the stories, but Japanese naval aviation was crippled in a few days. In the past, they had thought that America's resources were strained between two oceans. Rather, the reverse had taken place. If needed, carriers that have undermined Japanese power may be sent to the Atlantic to support the battle against the U-boat threat. The ramifications were staggering from a strategic standpoint. The Allies were able to reach farther than they could have with land-based aircraft thanks to carriers. Once protected only by destroyers, convoys now traveled under the aegis of escort carriers, which could patrol hundreds of miles around merchantmen who were at risk. While tiny ships fired Avengers and Wildcats straight from their decks, long-range bombers filled the mid-Atlantic gap. German seamen used to rejoice when they saw helpless freighters, but now they saw planes flying overhead all day and all night. Every patrol felt shorter than the last, and every surface carried the possibility of discovery. Losses increased gradually, and morale declined along with them. The story of industrial arithmetic was the most brutal. Germany had less than 60 ocean-going U-boats when it joined the war. Production rose at its height, but output was hindered by shortages of raw materials, skilled workers, and factories. In contrast, America launched carriers in such large numbers that even conservative projections left German officials in disbelief, complete with destroyer escorts, cruisers, and supply vessels. According to Allied intelligence assessments, one captured commander said it was like witnessing a foundry turned into a fleet. Although the wording was cautious, it conveyed the surprise of folks who had never imagined such a capability. This superiority changed naval warfare for the Allies. Fleets were able to project force anywhere in the world thanks to carriers, which became the strategic center. Once contested sea passages were now covered by protective air. The Atlantic lifeline to Britain remained safe, merchant deliveries increased, and submarine sinkings decreased. German aspirations to turn the tide with new submarine types like the Type XXI were still merely speculative by the end of 1944. The result had already been determined by industrial superiority. The effects on humans were equally severe. Young German sailors, many of whom had hardly received any training before being deployed on patrol, fought a losing battle at sea. A coherent narrative emerged from interrogation reports gathered in camps in the US, UK, and Canada. Despite their admiration for their leaders, these individuals acknowledged a persistent realization. The Reich was unable to keep up. They described convoys that no longer sailed in terror, of enemy industries that operated non-stop day and night, and of shipyards so large that even bombing strikes could not stop their work. The realization was devastating to men who had been brought up to believe that only skill and bravery determined success. Thus, one of the most severe lessons of the 20th century was demonstrated by the fight at sea. Countries won by maintaining production at a level that left rivals worn out, not just by bold moves or shrewd strategies. America's carriers were more than just military hardware. They were emblems of a historical industrial might. German POWs were acknowledging more than ships on the horizon as they expressed their surprise. Long before the first bomb dropped or the first torpedo hit, they were admitting that the battle had already been lost in the industries. Reflections from its captured sailors thus bore an unintentional honesty as the Reich fell apart on land and at sea. They knew their fate had been sealed when they caught a glimpse of the inexorable flow of industrial sea power. As Germany faced encirclement and the entire might of Allied power advancing toward the center of Europe, the narrative now shifted to the last reckoning.